Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever in the world you may be. On behalf of the Department of Law, North-South University, it is my utmost pleasure, and I would say privilege, to invite you to this webinar by Professor Obiora Okafor. Before I hand over to Professor Okafor to deliver his very timely talk, let me say a few words about the paper that he presented this evening. And what a better moment to have a webinar on a topic dealing with human rights on the International Universal Human Rights Day. Now, theoretically, we all tend to agree that human rights transcend borders. This is why they are known as human rights, as opposed to rights which are somehow dependent on national legal regimes. But as I understand it from the draft paper that Professor Okafor was kind enough to share with me, that he has presented some very interesting questions. He has taken, as I would call it, a sort of quasi-empirical approach. He has very carefully reviewed the public statements of some of the leading global actors, both from the global north and also from the global south. And also their voting patterns in 3 UN bodies, 3 I would say, most relevant bodies to deal with human rights issues: the United Nations General Assembly, United Nations Security Council, and United Nations Human Rights Council. And he, in my view, has very cogently argued that there is some paradox here. The northern states tend to focus on the enforcement of civil and political rights beyond borders. In that way, they have some sort of international human rights solidarity, as Professor Okafor has coined it. But when it comes to the economic and social rights, they are not so keen to invest, or they're sort of at times brush aside any sort of legal obligation to have that same human rights solidarity beyond borders when it comes to economic and social rights. On the other hand, the global southern actors tend to focus on these very economic and social rights, and they want to argue that when it comes to issues like COVID vaccine, there should be human rights obligations beyond borders. When it comes to the traditional civil and political rights, their stance is exactly the opposite. They tend to dismiss any foreign sort of intervention, let it be in some sort of sanction or some direct armed intervention. They tend to dismiss it. Now, I would not sort of take any position on these issues, nor, as I understand it, Professor Okafor has taken any particular position on this, but he has presented a very, I would say, probing set of questions, and I would leave it to Professor Okafor to say us more on that. I look forward to his presentation, and also I look forward to your questions, dear audience. Professor Okafor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Abdi, Rizwanul, for the an interesting coincidence on International Human Rights Day. I'm not sure we had that in mind, but it worked. It just worked out wonderfully. Thanks to your university. Thanks to the audience for making time. I think in Bangladesh it's a Saturday night. This is the problem with time zones. Here it's Saturday morning. Right now I'm sitting in Toronto, Canada. But anyway, I'm very glad to be speaking today to you all. And as MD has said, I'm going to, talk a little bit about a paper which is very much in preparation, but which is developed enough that we can present it. It is an Antinomies and Aporias, and don't worry, I'll explain what that means in official. And this is key official human rights solidarity argumentation on an international basis across the global south and north. Recovering what I call power interest, norms value, nexus, how they relate to each other, recalibrating that relationship. All right. Here is how the presentation will proceed. That is the outline. I will speak about the objectives, methodology, limitations of the study. I'll offer definitions of key terms that I use so that for better, greater understanding. And then I'll look at these antinomies and aporias that I sort of appear in the title, how that tendency manifests in actual conversation, statements, votes that are taken by the samples of states, both from the global north and the global south, and then I'll pause on recovering why it's important, or how this implies that we need to recover or recalibrate this power interest norms value nexus in this particular area. And of course, I'll then conclude. So basically, the paper, as I said, what I try to do is tease out and sort of theorize, reflect on particular antinomies and aporias. They're similar terms, but I will explain why I separate them out, that tend to sort of characterize the international human rights solidarity argumentation that global south states tend to make, global north states tend to make. Now, of course, I keep repeating this throughout the presentation, but it's important at the outset to underline that not every single global north country might, manifest that tendency each and every time, and not every single global south country might manifest that tendency each and every time in the records of proceedings of these UN bodies that are sampled. So like I said, I'm still working through the paper. I would say it's 80% done or so, still polishing it, looking at some of the data. And the focus is on the broad tendencies I've just tried to say, right? There's diversity within the North and South. There's a broad tendencies in these bodies of argumentation. And then it is also with regard, the paper focuses on the appropriateness, on the arguments that they make about the appropriateness or otherwise of the imposition of international legal obligations. This is very important because if you remove legal obligation and you substitute charity, the same argument cannot be made. But once you start talking about binding legal obligations, that's where I think this argument is deeply and well-founded, right? So I'm speaking about the arguments that these states, global north states, global south states tend to make about legal international law obligations to express international solidarity to victims of human rights violations, right? Or deprivations. Okay. And here again, I'm not only or merely concerned with saying, teasing out these aporias and say, oh, here there are aporias, there are antinomies, there are paradoxes, right? That is important. It's important to demonstrate that you have these paradoxes, these antinomies and aporias, but I'm also, in addition, interested in other things that are entailed. The first is how these antinomies and aporias circulate in plain sight, right? Without, with the sort of straight faces being made by either the states involved or certain scholars that defend those positions, right? As if they don't exist. What does that suggest to us? The second is, how do these antinomies, the existence of these antinomies and aporias, these paradoxes, how does it relate to the arguments about state sovereignty that these global north on the one hand and global south states make, right? What is the relationship, right? And then on the connections of all this to global power relations as constitutive of ideas, right? As shaping our imagination, for example, about who good human rights actors are or not, right? So that's what I'm trying to end on, that in fact, these are ideationally constitutive. They're not just paradoxes that exist and they're harmless. They actually shape our ideas, our values, our notions, our senses of who global actors are, who are obeying international law, who are anti-international law, and so on. All right. So, okay. So, and then of course, this is all connected to the relative roles of both norms and values on the one hand and power on the other hand, right? What is at play? Are they states simply in this official international solidarity argumentation? Are they pursuing the promotion of value? Or are they pursuing the expansion or consolidation of power, or both? And if likely both, to what extent relative to each other are they pursuing each? Okay, so it's a slightly complicated, but not that complicated argument. Okay, so like MD pointed at the outset, in this particular paper, elsewhere I've made my opinions clear, but in this particular paper, the point is not to focus on whether they are wrong to make each argument. The point is that when you put those two arguments about human rights, or those different categories of arguments, paradoxes are revealed, antinomies are aporias. All right. So just to give you a teaser at the outset, right? The kinds of questions that occupy the paper, for example, if you look at the responsibility to protect, not as charity, but as hard law obligation in not soft law, charity, and so on, in the way it is stated in the official R2P documents, the responsibility to protect, right? The legally binding R2P does not extend to alleviation of poverty or protection of economic and social rights. Why? Are those not human rights, right? You would ask. So why doesn't R2P, for example, why do global north states not accept that R2P should extend to access of peoples in the global south to COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics? Look at the struggles, for example, in the WTO, and even that the minimal agreement was reached just on vaccines and not yet therapeutics about this issue. Why don't global north states readily accept it? Why don't global north states, why do they tend to strongly oppose legally binding R2P or international solidarity obligations in such cases when it comes to economic and social rights, while on the other hand, global south countries tend to support it? On the other hand, you could also say, with significant exceptions, always, of course, like I said, there's some diversity within these categories of global north and south. Why do these global south countries who usually endorse binding international human rights solidarity obligations, legally binding obligations on the global level, when economic and social rights are involved, also at the same time oppose such legally binding, or tend to oppose such legally binding obligations, in favor of global states when global states want to intervene to protect egregious violations of civil and political rights? Again, not in every case, but these are about tendencies that manifest both among the category of global south countries and among the category of global north countries. Okay, so what I'm suggesting at the outset with this teaser is that the above, what I've just quickly described, and we can expand it in conversation afterward, is that you can't adequately explain this simply by referring to the inherent or immanent power of human rights ideas and values, right? That these states are simply either pursuing human rights value or not pursuing human rights. It's not an adequate explanatory, right? Clearly, much more is at play. Otherwise, they would have a similar attitude to all human rights almost all the time, right? But they don't. When you separate out human rights by category, you see that they're treated differently, depending on the states, the kinds of states involved. And that's why I'm suggesting that other things are involved, perhaps power, interest, and that are more involved than is usually acknowledged, either by those states themselves or by too many scholars. Okay, so in terms of methodology, as you were told by MD at the outset, what I tried to do was to use a quasi-empirical methodology. I surveyed and analyzed sample slices of both Global North and Global South international human rights argumentation. So when I say official human rights, international human rights argumentation, it means those made by states, not by NGOs or by ordinary people or by scholars, okay? So only official state-made argumentation was surveyed and analyzed. And even then, to keep the data size manageable, I looked at only such official argumentation within the UN. And again, even then, to keep it, reducing from billions of pages to thousands of pages, I had to narrow that again to only 3 major UN bodies: UN Security Council, General Assembly, and Human Rights Council. And then, even then, I had to also limit it by date between 2007, when the Human Rights Council was constituted, replacing the old Commission on Human Rights, and 2022 so far. Just again, to keep the data, sample data size that we had to, wade through, manageable and doable. Otherwise, we'll be doing this for the next 30 years. So in terms of the sample of Global North states, I purposively selected that sample, and we can discuss why a purposive sample and not a random sample. The US, France, UK, Japan, Russia, and the EU. Some other places would ask, why Russia? Well, Russia is a global North country. You can't really, even though it tends to buck the trend of most of the other and oppose, flip what the other states tend to do, but it is a global North country on any measure. Global South countries, again, Brazil, India, China, Nigeria, AU. Again, the question in the paper itself, I spent some time explaining why China is in the Global South. Now, again, we don't have time now, but somebody has a question, we can explain more. But the short answer is China's voting behavior and also behavior. It is historically Global South, only recently, but has continued to associate with the G77, which is a group of Global South countries on almost any vote, right? So it hasn't really broken away. I mean, I said in the paper, I said it's a borderline case. You could classify it as Global North. It is the second most powerful country on any measure in the world, right? So you could say it's Global North now, but you could also say it's Global South because of its historical and antecedents, similarity of history and sort of its tendencies in the UN. But I made the choice to put it in this particular study in the Global South category for now. Okay, limits of the study, I've already mentioned some. Only official argumentation within the UN for particular set number of years in order to keep the data manageable. But none of this is fatal because the sample slice is representative enough, and the pre-existing literature also supports the tendencies that we found. Okay, definition of key terms, because this is important so that you understand what I'm arguing. So in terms of solidarity, I may not necessarily read it out. I use the definition that previous independent experts, including the current one myself, have used of what international solidarity means. I mean, it's a long-standing one. And also is the definition in the current draft UN Declaration on Human Rights International Solidarity, which is a spirit of unity amongst individuals, peoples, states, and organizations, to put it simply. Antinomy simply refers to logical contradictions or paradoxes, right? Or disjunctures, logical contradictions in logic. Now, it is very similar to an aporia, but it's not the exact same thing. An aporia is an irresolvable internal contradiction or disjunction in an argument, all right? So I kept those two separate because the one question was, okay, here are the paradoxes. Are they resolvable? Is there a time when states are going to simply then just discard these paradoxes? I didn't see that as a possibility, at least not in my lifetime. And therefore, that's why I kept a separate category of aporia. Otherwise, I could have just used antinomy, aporia, or paradox, right? So just to explain why those two terms are used separately in the paper and this presentation. But with aporia, there's also a hint of a paradox or a contradiction being a sort of a creative force that can lead to improvements, right? That's some usages of aporia, and I cite Rahman, for example, his book Interpretations. He talks about aporias, yes, contradictions, but I don't know, I think he maybe comes from Marxian thought, where you have contradictions and then thesis and antithesis leads to a synthesis and you have a new reality. So there's always this hint that, yes, there might be an aporia, but this is in fact what creates a new reality. And Bakshi himself, Upendra Bakshi, the great Indian scholar, while writing about the future of human rights, has long taught us that human rights has always accommodated contradictions, both the politics of emancipation and the politics of domination. The people who chant freedom of expression can range from Ku Klux Klan Nazi types who are saying, I want my freedom of expression, to people who were camped in Tahrir Square in Egypt who had a politics of liberation, right? So just a human rights politics is not always a progressive politics, right? So this is the point that Bazi makes. And that contradiction has progressively improved human society. So that's why, just to explain why aporia is also another reason why it's important to keep antinomy and aporia separate. Power, as I use it, is largely Weberian, the possibility of forcing one's will or behavior on others. Of course, one must always realize, as Foucault has taught us, that power is relational, right? It's not simply a thing that sits somewhere. It is relational, as between the two elements or two figures or agents that are at issue. So you always have to look at power in relation to what, right? So interest, not that complex, something that improves one's position or you see as improving your position. Norms, the way I use norms here is as a standard, an authoritative standard for assessing conduct. Values are connected to norms but different. And as I use them in the paper, values here are used in terms of what is deemed good, what people look at as good, right? The good thing to do, such as when we say that knowledge or justice, for example, are values. That's the sense in which I use values. Excellent. Now that I've spent so much of my time introducing the paper and defining my terms, I want to perhaps in a slightly more detail allude to the argument that I've teased you with in the beginning. And so let's look at the broad character of the Global North's International Human Rights Solidarity Argumentation. Of course, there's a lot more in the paper, but in a 30-minute presentation, I can't really discuss all the details, but we can have a conversation afterwards. So in terms of this, the character, broadly speaking, of the Global North's International Human Rights Solidarity Argumentation, sorry, that should be UNHRC at the end there. The General Assembly, Security Council, Human Rights Council records that are analyzed indicate very strong opposition of Global North countries to, again, legally binding, or in fact, even strongly persuasive or hortatory international economic and social rights solidarity, right? And this includes the arguments they made, for example, during negotiations for the adoption of the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, right? They argued almost to the state, to the global North state, that solidarity to other peoples or other countries for the realization of economic and social rights is not legally binding and should not be legally binding. But these are the same countries, again, as I say in the next point on the slide, that always argue that civil and political rights obligations that they owe to these same global South peoples are legally binding. They should be able to intervene when those rights are violated, right? But here they're saying, no, we shouldn't be forced to intervene when there should be no binding obligation to intervene when economic consider, because you know what, as I say later, that's gonna take money out of people's pockets, right? So of course, as I said at the outset, nuances of course do exist among global North states. For example, the most glaring is that Russia's voting pattern actually flips that of other global North states. It tends to vote for economic and social rights and against civil and political rights. Again, you can look at that as maybe the socialist or communist origins of Russia from the Soviet Union, but also mixed up with the kinds of regime type they have at home, right? So they don't tend to vote with the other global North countries, which tend to, other than Japan, tend to be Western countries. So there's nuances within this category. Okay, so the issue is, if this is what we're observing from a detailed examination of the data, their actual statements and voting patterns at the UN, these UN bodies that were sampled, are these antinomies, are there antinomies here? Are there aporias? My conclusion in the paper is that yes. Why are there antinomies and paradoxes, shall we say? The point I made in the paper is, why would a state accept, or why would these states accept, as they do, that both economic and social rights and civil and political rights are indivisible and that interdependent? You go to the Vienna Declaration of Action. This is a long time ago. For one category, but not the other, right? That's clearly a paradox. That's at least a logical disjuncture. And then I claim that's clearly an antinomy. Now, for it to be an aporia, it has to be resolvable, right? That paradox or that logical contradiction. So is there an aporia here? I think there is. Because the contradiction appears irresolvable, at least for now, like I said, at least in my lifetime, in the foreseeable future, because of what I see as the deep, strong interests that drive these contradictions, right? They don't just appear. They are driven by very strong socioeconomic and power relations calculus, right? And so it's not likely to be resolvable because of where they stem from. And so I see that an aporia also exists. Now, the question then is, does this aporia have some creative potential, like Rahman and people like Bakshi have hinted at? Could highlighting these aporias trouble the global North's official human rights narratives or human rights solidarity narratives, trouble it enough to produce a change, right? As at the UN, all of a sudden they would agree that international economic and social rights solidarity obligations, legally binding ones, should be entertained. Well, I'll say over the long durée, over the long arc of time, perhaps so, but I'm not terribly optimistic right now as I speak, given my own knowledge of the history of international relations and international law, and the interest calculus, right, in shaping behavior. Now, in terms of the global South, the broad character of global South's international human rights solidarity argumentation it's almost basically the inverse, right? Or near inverse of the global north with a slight modification. So it's kind of like you flip, it's a flip of the global north tendency or broad character. Now, the UN records that we conversed show, myself and my research assistants conversed, show that their opposition, or at the very least, strong hesitation, right, with regard to accepting legally binding international civil and political rights solidarity obligations that the global north often wants to extend to their peoples. It's palpable, it's very clear on the face of this record. Excuse me. But I think, sorry, that last point should be economic and social rights here. But the same records, when you look at them, show strong support for legally binding international economic and social rights solidarity obligations. Now, again, like I said, there are nuances, of course, in the pattern of behavior of global South states. Sometimes they do actually vote for these international civil and political rights solidarity interventions, right? For example, African states who tend to vote when they voted, say, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Gambia recently to restore democracy and so on, especially if it's a resolution to authorize the African Union to do something. And then when you go, remember, I'm not looking at the regional behavior. The regional behavior is actually more complicated, but this is on the global plane, right, that I'm analyzing. Okay, and so if they have one position for economic and social rights and the opposite for civil and political rights, the same kinds of antinomies and aporias exist, right? And that's what I'm arguing. And the same argument I just made with regard to the global north applies with regard to whether that those antinomies are resolvable or not. I don't think they're easily, shall we say, easily resolved in the near future. The last sort of segment before I conclude and we have a conversation, the paper sort of ends with me considering the relationship, two things. One, the relationship between human rights solidarity argumentation and its state sovereignty counterpart. That's state sovereignty argumentation, again, official, made by states. Now, excuse me. Now, both the global north and global south, each, they tend to make official human rights solidarity argumentation, that they view as more protective of their freedom of action or as conferring relative advantage on them when it comes to when they are speaking across the global north-south axis, right? That's what I have found from analyzing the pattern of behavior. Now, this suggests that something significantly more than just the inherent or immanent or social power of the ideas, the human rights ideas and values at issue is in play in that state behavior, right? It can't just be that. There has to be something more that is in play, right? And also it's clear that similarly situated countries, so global south countries tend to be similarly situated, perhaps with the notable exception of China. Global north countries tend to be similarly situated with the notable, say Russia, right? So when it comes to, when they're similarly situated in socioeconomic and political power, developmental terms, also in terms of their historical experience, they tend to make similar kinds of international human rights, official human rights solidarity arguments. And then again, suggesting yet again that much more than the power of norms is in play, and suggesting that the interest power, that's political power, socioeconomic power, military power, an advantage, and also freedom of action, right? Their freedom to do whatever they like and advance their interests is as important, at the very least, as the push to protect and promote human rights globally. Now, someone listening to me to think that the paper set out to defend realism, that's international relations realism, for those who know a realist thought, which basically tends to explain everything away by saying, oh, it's just power and the pursuit of raw power and interest that explains it. That is not the argument here, right? The argument is not that simple, right? The argument is more not that power explains everything, but that we need to recover much more the role that power plays in human rights argumentation, official human rights argumentation, so official international human rights solidarity argumentation, right? And that role of power has been marginalized too much and too far displaced, leaving us almost starry-eyed about these human rights solidarity claims that many states make, that they're defending human rights here or there. If they are really only acting in the defense of human rights, why not for economic and social rights and civil and political rights always together in the same robust way? That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you so much for your attention. And I think I'll stop sharing unless people want me to keep sharing. Is that okay, MD, to stop sharing?
Yeah, thank you. Please go ahead. Now, thank you once again for your excellent presentation. Let me put the first question to you, Professor Okafor. Do you think the historical experience of the global South and maybe also of the global North have anything to do with the positions that they are taking on the theme that you have presented?
I think it does have a lot to do, and it's not a historical experience that is an empty box in it, right? It's a historical experience of something. And when you look closely, what is that historical experience, say, for example, of the global North? And that's why I tended to put China here. It's a historical experience of subordination by power and interest. So that when a global North state comes with civil and political rights solidarity, right, the first move is suspicion, right? It's like, well, this is how you came actually to colonize us. You said you were coming to help us out on the civilizing mission, if people remember, and so on. And you ended up taking billions of resources back to Europe from us, So there's that suspicion. I agree entirely that the historical experience, and of course, this is one of the insights of 2L scholarship in human rights, dating not just with this generation, from even Upendra Bakshi's generation, Pianan, people like that, the Nigerian Mosrike, to show how colonialism shaped the attitude of third world states, as they used to be called, global South states, historically over time. So yeah, I think that it does, but again, it connects very well to the power interest nexus, power interest slash ideas values nexus, that norms value nexus that I want us to recover, right? Like how do you calibrate the relationship of those two at where they meet? Because they do combine to produce the reality we observe in those texts. But the issue is with what relative weight do they combine? And so far, the official argumentation doesn't acknowledge that. It tends to be, oh, it's all about human. No, it's not. Is my point. It's not all about human rights. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. The next question would be, what about the pattern of these selected states that you have covered in your paper? Do they behave in the same way in regional bodies, let's say in the African Union or EU or OAS? Yeah. Do they behave the same way, or you see any change there?
Again, very good one and nuance. Yes, they don't necessarily behave the same, but there there are echoes, shall we say, of that historical experience plus their behavior on the global plane, even on the regional level. But they are much more comfortable with those same interventions that the same global South regional organizations, take the African Union, you would see them strongly oppose at the UN level intervention. But if you come to ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, African Union, you see very strong sanctions regimes for human rights, very strong interventionist regimes and apparatus, right? Sending armies twice in the last 10 years to Mali and Gambia to restore democracy, deeply sanctioning the unconstitutional changes of government that have happened on the country, except when very strong states like Egypt or Nigeria involved. I'm just being a little bit, shall I say, naughty there, but that is the reality, right? So you see that complicated, but still, you would see, because of their historical experience, you see emphasis on collective decision making, no unilateral sanctions, no unilateral invasions or interventions, for instance, are approved. It's collective. Everyone has to vote and favor it pretty much, and all that. These are measures that stem from their historical experience of really the abuse of power that comes with these moves that are ostensibly often well-intentioned originally to protect civil and political rights, let's say, in other countries, right, on the global level. So it is related, both similar and different in some ways on the regional level. But that's a whole different thing. We didn't get into that again because of space and time and all that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now the next question, and I think a related question that comes, is on the sort of slight deviation from their standard pattern of action. So China, as you have already mentioned, and also India, that traditionally they are opposed to any unilateral sanction or intervention. Could you cite some examples where they have at least partially deviated from the pattern? And if they have, what you think would have prompted them to do so? Thank you.
Well, because most of our audience is in Bangladesh, perhaps the best example in India is Bangladesh, right? So historically, which used to be, of course, East Pakistan, right? And India, of course, was robustly interventionist against West Pakistan, right, in support of Bangladeshi self-determination. So things like that. So, for example, all those countries have historically carved out what they call anti-colonial self-determination out of their opposition to non-intervention. So, for example, during apartheid in South Africa, all African countries were for heavy sanctions against South Africa, against Zimbabwe under white rule, and so on. And it was even written into the then OAU, Organization of African States Constitution. In terms of China, although Taiwan is a complicated issue, so maybe that's not a good example. China tends to be more consistently opposed, except that soon after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, it tended not to block interventions, right? The interventions, all the UN peace enforcement actions. Now it's back to blocking most of them, but it tended not to block them, perhaps because of its own interest. It was on less firm ground then, as a superpower, right? And didn't want to jeopardize its economic rights. So it tended to abstain, not necessarily vote in favor, but tended to abstain from the Security Council resolutions authorizing those, including recently in Libya, for instance, which actually Libya got a lot of Global South, including not entirely African Union opposed it, but a lot of African countries voted for it. So that's why I say that there are complications and nuances in all of this, and that's why we're looking at just the broad tendency or how they lean, right? Generally,
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that there may be some sort of lack of commitment to sort of invest resources to solve the problem of others? Because when it comes to the economic and social rights, most of them would entail some sort of investment of resources. Of course, even any intervention, armed intervention would also mean commitment of resources in another form. But do you think that sort of an issue which might have influenced the position of some of these states, that they do not want to commit to, let's say, COVID vaccine because it is a strain on your taxpayers' money?
No, I agree. I agree. The resources, and as you very well put it, even in terms of intervening to protect civil and political rights, for example, sending a force, there's a lot of investment, which is why sometimes they don't, right? But in terms of the conceptual point about should there be a norm authorizing that, they always vote for it, right? But when it comes to economic and social rights, they use the resources to say no. But in fact, the reality is that if you were to have a norm, which you do have, I have argued myself in another context, and of course, it's not just me, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has said so clearly, that all states in a position to do, which in practice really means mostly global South North countries, have an obligation, legal obligation under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to express solidarity, to assist other countries that are less endowed in the realization of the economic and social rights as a duty to cooperate, right? So that's established by the committee. It's not just Professor Okafor arguing this, right? But anyway, they oppose that based on resources. But in fact, what they're opposing is their freedom of action being constrained. Because what happens is they then, on the basis of charity, claim to be investing resources in these same countries through development aid. Are you getting my question? It's not resources only, but it's more freedom of action to leverage their resources in ways that advance their interest. And that's why I argue that we need to, again, recover the power interest versus norm values nexus, recalibrate how this pursuit of normative values relates to power and interest, right? When we discuss this issue. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that answer. The next question that I have for you would be, after all, we tend to say that human rights are universal. Now, when states seem to have this kind of a pattern that on one set of rights, they take one sort of stance, and on the other side, other kind of issues, they take the exactly opposite stance. Do you think somehow that confuses the public discourse? Does that have any sort of adverse impact on the quote-unquote universality of human rights, you think?
I think it does to the discerning mind, right? Or those who pay attention. And I think even beyond that, I think it resonates when people sort of, one of my students have described it as hypocrisy. I wouldn't necessarily call it only just hypocrisy. I think it's just a pursuit of freedom of action, interest, right? And advancement of one's position, which most states are not free of. It's just a matter of degree, right? And it's just a matter of the influence of values to tone that down, and what values are important to them enough to tone that down a bit, right? So yeah, so I think it muddies the water a lot, I think, because the way it comes across is hypocrisy, right? And people are like, well, you're not really for human rights, they're just to advancing their power. And then the human rights value gets lost a lot of times because of this aggregate overall sort of littering or muddying of that water by Aporias, just by Antinomies and Aporias, right? The water gets so muddy that the pearl of human rights that is at the bottom of to sustain my metaphor, at the bottom of that lake or pond is you can't see it, right? In many cases, or it doesn't shine as brightly. So so I think it is problematic. I don't think it's just innocent. Yeah.
Thank you so much. The next question would be on the sort of this role of the non-state actors whom you have not so much covered in your paper, but I was wondering, do you have any views on how the leading international NGOs or scholars like you, how could we have a sort of a role in addressing these paradoxes and making some of these norms more universally applicable? Do we have any role really?
Yeah, I'll start with scholars. I think that scholars, our role is somewhat clear, which is to critique it, or at least comment on it, right? And if we feel like critiquing it, to critique such things. If you're a critical scholar, then you should critique, right? Which is what a lot of critical scholars have done in different. I've just brought the apparatus of third world approaches to international law to this particular aspect of human rights. But if you look at human rights scholarship, scholars like Bakshi, Mukau Mutua, and Tony Angi, I've been doing this, some of my work, I've done this for a long time to critique these, shine that lens and expose it, right? Expose it and, hem it in as much as we can, because it is difficult, because it is driven, as I said, by very strong urges on part of states. That behavior doesn't just come from a sort of, I don't know, superficial need to produce paradoxes, right? Those paradoxes are produced by very deep forces, very strong forces, in terms of state, running states, expanding their power and pursuing their interests. So those are difficult forces to resist. I think that this is where civil society, NGOs, and so on come in, because they are better able within their own states even. So northern NGOs within the north, southern NGOs within the south. For example, there are success stories. It's not all doom and gloom. When I was growing up, for 30 years of my life, Nigeria was ruled by the military. Military rule, some more brutal than others. But civil society pursued a 30-year struggle to really confine the military to barracks and succeeded, where they have not succeeded in many countries like Egypt and Pakistan. Even when they have democratic rule, the military is extremely powerful. Not so in Nigeria anymore. So they were really delegitimized in terms of their pursuit of political power, holding the reins of power. And it was a process of ideational change that took 30-something years to occur. And it was a delegitimizing of this notion that the military were better than civilians, military was better, more effective, and all that. So there's been places where that has succeeded, but not so much in other places. So both within specific countries, both global north, global south, and across that axis, international civil society also has a role to struggle really on the ground in order to, as best we can, rein in these forces. We can't eliminate them. I do not foresee a day when power and interest will not drive states. It's almost essential to the very nature of state formation. Thank God they no longer claim a right to wage war at will. I mean, with exceptions here and there, at least not under international law. There was a time when the states claimed that right, and it wasn't customary international law that they could just go to war for no reason, right? So the states almost have this, not essence, but this sort of underlying and deep structural, not structural, deep push to will to power and to expand their interests and advantage, that you need civil society to wage underground struggles in order to discipline that. But it takes time. It takes time to happen. And then that would have important implications for the foreign policy of states and therefore their human rights solidarity argumentation at the UN. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now, one of our students, MD Taslim Bhuiya Prantik, he has asked a question that, what is your view on the proposition that the challenge is to build unprecedented solidarity that is neither naive nor coercive, but for that you need transformative civic education? What do you say to that?
I agree entirely. That's why I'm a teacher. And that's why I do research like this. I'm not just doing it, just to poke, pin needles in somebody's leg or the states, right? Who produce these paradoxes, who produce these antinomies and aporias, right? You expose it so that hopefully it has a teaching function, right? We know what you're doing, kind of thing, and then your students learn this. They're the ones who are going to also become legal advisors. They're going to become foreign diplomats and so on. And at least next generation need to be a bit better, right? So I agree, but of course, what I forget the student's name. What the student was talking about is bigger, more expansive than that, which is civic education, not just inside classrooms, but beyond the classroom, right? Radio, TV, campaigns, mobilization by civil society, political forces, and so on. I agree entirely. This is how colonialism was defeated. In fact, I've always wanted to write a piece on comparing current civil society in Africa with anti-colonial movements, right? I've alluded to this in many pieces I've written. They resonated a lot more because they were on the ground, village to village, village square to village square, civic education. That was key, first of all, to fight colonialism, to mobilize ordinary people, right? Ordinary people on the streets, anywhere, and not just in the classroom. We all have our role. So that's why I say civil society almost has a more important role than even academics, even scholars. Yeah. But scholars, of course, are essential to produce the knowledge, right? To produce the clarifications, to spend time peering through, how many people have time to go through thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages of UN debates. I mean, that's a huge privilege for which people like me are very thankful, right? It's work, it's backbreaking work, but still a very privileged. I know other tasks that are much more backbreaking, like literally. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are almost out of time, so this would be our last question. This is in relation to another point that you have already made. It's about the regional bodies. Let's say, would it be fair to say that maybe African states have been a little more receptive in imposing sanctions on African states by African states than by the UN Security Council? If that hasn't been the case, why? If not, why not? Do you have any views on those? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think they have definitely been more receptive to sanctions and interventions in not all the time, but in cases that they view as deserving or sort of more extreme cases. In other words, for example, take democratization, not for every breach of a democratic norm, but for things like, military coups, definitely, almost always, there are massive sanctions. I often show my students the list of sanctions imposed against Mali when there was a military coup. Then, not that it changed it made them start the military coup, but they were unprecedented. If the UN imposed those kind of sanctions, there'll be a massive outcry, like total blockade of the country. Only one country, but this was by the Economic Community of West African States. Only one West African country that is not a member, which borders Mali, was able to give them a reprieve. Otherwise, Mali would have been completely encircled. They couldn't do business with any country. They couldn't do anything. No importation, exportation, except they couldn't fly. I mean, it's a very punitive, not punitive, but very tough, right? So I think they're definitely more willing when it is themselves collectively, other than, of course, the sanctioned state, making that decision. And I think that the collective decision-making is a lesson from their historical experience on the global level, right? That unilateral sanctions are more dangerous than collective sanctions, or even sanctions by a few powerful countries, P5 states, dominated Security Council. So yes, they'll be much more willing to impose support sanctions on the regional level. African solutions to African problems is the mantra that they often use, than they are. And again, not because of MD, what you pointed out, a historical experience of global subordination. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you once again for this wonderful talk. I'm sure I would look forward to reading your final paper. Thank you, audience, for your time. Have a good day.